Welcome to the lecture on structural theories, where we're going to talk about concepts of trade, development, and how they're impacted by the structure of capitalism. So let's start the lecture where we talk about what the world is and what it looks like. When I ask you what the world looks like, you might say, Dr. Mutlu, this is what the world looks like. But what if I told you that this is actually a particular representation of the world that puts Europe at the center, presumably or primarily designed for nautical navigation between Europe and their colonies? And another alternative representation of the world might look like this. In this representation, you'll notice that Africa and Greenland are comparable size, whereas in this representation, you'll notice how much larger Africa is relative to somewhere like Greenland. And you might argue, well, what's the importance? What's the significance? A counterpoint to that would be representation matters. But also, why is Africa represented the way that it is? Or why is South America represented the way that it is? And that might have something to do with global capitalism and how connected or disconnected these continents might be. If we look at world air travel, we'll notice that certain parts of the world are more connected than other parts of the world, and that's because that's where the money is. So in a way, money makes the world turn round and round. And in some ways, there is an inherent violence within that system. There's an inherent violence within the structures of capitalism. At least that's what the Marxists argue. A rule of the market is that it's determined by supply and demand. The value or the sort of the laws of the market are, according to Adam Smith, are determined by an invisible hand of the supply and demand relationship or the supply and demand equilibrium. So there is ways in which the price of a thing goes up or down, and that's usually sort of due to a relationship between supply and demand. So if demand increases and supply remains unchanged, the price goes up. If the demand decreases and supply remains unchanged, then the price goes down. If the demand remains the same, but the supply increases, then the price goes down. And if the demand remains the same, but the supply decreases, then the price goes up. That's a simple description of how the supply and demand relationship works. This man, Karl Marx, argues that that relationship between supply and demand is one side of it, but another side of this relationship is embedded within capitalism, and that's the sort of the need for a constantly expanding market, where the market chases the whole surface of the world, and that the market must sort of become everywhere, settle everywhere, and establish connections everywhere. So everything becomes the market. The past, the present, the future, different commodities, different geographies, people who are registered, non-registered, they all become part of the system. Marx comes to these conclusions within his Communist Manifesto, which when he was writing it looked like this, and when it was finished, it had some amazing one-liners, where, according to Marx and Engels, the triumph of capitalism drowned the ecstasies of religious fervor in the icy waters of egotistical calculations, meaning that religion was killed by rational decisions, rational choice, self-interested choice of here and now. Capitalism has resolved personal worth into exchange value, that we all have salaries, we all put a value to ourselves. And in the place of numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms has set up one single unconscionable freedom, free trade, that you are free to trade whatever you want, including your own services, your own skills. Stripped of its halo, every occupation honored and looked up to is no longer the kinds of things that historically gave meaning or value to a job, like being the blacksmith in a town or being the sort of, miller in a town, etc., have gradually became just jobs, that we no longer sort of see jobs as sort of social status symbols, but just as jobs. And then torn away from the family, its sentimental veil, and has reduced the family to a mere money relation. Another argument. But perhaps another side effect that Marx and Engels highlight in their sort of manifesto is the epidemic of the overproduction. That competition among different countries or among different actors drive down labor price, which then in return shrinks demand, which leads to overproduction, which then drives down the prices. And in this cycle, this epidemic of overproduction, poor suffer the most because as the sort of the least protected, their wages and prices of things drop. That is important to understand. Another thing that is important to understand here is that value in society, value in contemporary economics, is essentially about labor. That the difference between raw materials and finished goods is labor. So the more labor is required for a product, the more valuable that product is going to be. But the value of what one makes is inevitably greater than the wages paid by their employers. So then the surplus that is extracted from that is the profit, the difference between what someone pays their laborer versus what it costs to sort of sell something. So the more we reduce the price of the labor, the more profit can be made in these interactions. So in this sort of like so-called race to the bottom, individuals, factories, towns assume that it was the machines and not the system that was sort of the cause of them getting poorer and poorer. And in essence, as Marx and Engels argue, it's the mutual competition within the class that prevents the cohesion of that group emerging as a class. And in many ways, the real economic growth, according to Marx and Engels, will come through the spread of unions and a spread of a proletarian class consciousness that inevitably leads to a political party, which in their case would be sort of a communist party. So in Marx's words, all fixed, fast-frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melt into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real condition of life and his relations with his kind, which to them is capitalism. And it's a problem. So, according to, again, Marx and Engels, each mode of production, whether that was feudal, mercantile, or capitalist, has an oppressive and non-producing class and an exploited class of producers. In this case, from their perspective, state is an instrument of oppression, a tool of the bourgeoisie, and politics is subordinate to economics. They argue that the state is closely associated to the leading capitalist class and is complicit in the oppression. And structural Marxists here argue that policies of the welfare state represent a trade-off in which the capitalist class buys off the working class by making their poverty somewhat more bearable. And in some ways, the Marxist system can be characterized by this image. Capitalism at the top, the ruling class, the religion class, the military, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat. That this is the sort of capitalist system that just sort of goes. I don't know if you guys had a chance to watch last year's Oscar winner, Parasite, a Korean film. And that film had a particular kind of class dynamic within it. I would strongly encourage, if you haven't seen that movie, to watch it. It's a really interesting film. And when I first saw the title and sort of heard about it, I thought maybe it was going to be a sci-fi film. But when you watch the movie, you realize that it's actually sort of an allegory for class. And the question is not that there's a parasite. The question is, who is the parasite in the film? Who is leeching off on the other? Because as you watch the film, you'll notice that there is a sort of a presumed parasite versus a parasite that appears. Or the same filmmaker had made a previous film called Snowpiercer, where at the end of the world, in a sort of a global climate change, there's a train, and each section of the train represents a particular kind of class. And it's important to understand this is a particular structural understanding where the assumption here is that the capitalism as a structure enables this to emerge. So the actors within them have particular roles, but no one particularly controls the system. Capitalism controls itself, or at best, sort of like the bourgeoisie determines everything else in the system. So according to Marx, there is stages or sort of steps of history, and history moves in sort of a teleological or in a certain directional way. So you move from primitive societies to feudal societies, to mercantilist societies, to capitalist societies, to socialist societies, to communist societies. This is Marx's way of thinking about it. But in many ways, the reality never followed this path. That in so many ways, I think the two successful examples of quote unquote communist revolutions happened not in societies that were heavily capitalistic, but rather sort of happened in societies that were either feudal or mercantilist, in the case of China and Russia. So that the stage, the sort of the capitalist exploitation was not necessarily the driving force, but rather it was sort of a political revolution that caused the events. So Marx thought that imperialism was beneficial to places like India and China because it forcibly introduced capitalism, which was to him an improvement over feudalism. He argued that there was no class tension in these societies because of centralized land ownership. So there was no transformation from feudal to capitalist land ownership, therefore no historical development in his case. Another notable Marxist, John Hobson, or sort of a structural materialist, John Hobson, argued that imperialism solved three problems for capitalist societies: low wages and underconsumption by workers, oversaving by capitalists, and overproduction, because colonies became market for overproduction and investment, and the lower wage jobs moved to the periphery, whereas the sort of the core maintained higher wage jobs. So the wealth came back to the core, whereas the periphery was exploited. Lenin, looking at the same problem, thought that when the revolution did not occur, that imperialism explained the continued survival of capitalism, because imperialism provided raw materials to the centers and an outlet for the surplus of capital and goods. Therefore, the colonies kind of worked as an escape valve and a pressure cooker for capitalism's inherent contradictions. So when imperialism ended and the revolution still did not come, Marxists then blamed neocolonialism, or the continued exploitation of the post-colonies by the multinational corporations in the states of the North. But another explanation of why revolution doesn't happen comes from another author named Karl Polanyi, where he argues that transformation to free market in the form of like capitalistic free market required and continues to require a great deal of government action and government corrections, if you will. So a free market, when it runs amok, creates social tensions, and then government interventions fixes those social tensions, but then causes inefficiency. So there's this constant sort of back and forth between free market and government intervention that just sort of happens over time, over and over again. So in so many ways, creation of a free market requires a great deal of intervention, and those interventions are all there to sort of solve the disruptions, inequalities, and social problems that these things cause. So, according to Polanyi, a self-regulating market demands nothing less than institutional separation of society into an economic, political spheres. And in some ways, we see this sort of pressure to liberalize and open up, and in many ways sort of like find a balance between government interventions versus free market in conversations around development in the global south. So maybe it's time we ask ourselves the quintessential international political economy question, which is how do developing countries develop themselves? Well, if free market is the way to go, then there are some tensions, there are some problems in here. On the one hand, there is the market sort of talks about unrestricted price domination of labor and unrestricted price domination of land, that these things are going to find themselves through a supply and demand model. But at the same time, the unrestricted price domination of labor in the global context manifests itself in oppression, repression, and exploitation, whereas the unrestricted price domination of nature, or the land, manifests itself in race to the bottom and environmental destruction. So then there must be some models, there must be some ways for this to happen. One model is import substitution industrialization. The acronym for it is ISI. And what this does is states use tariffs and other kinds of barriers to protect their infant industries. So they use domestic demands as a substitute for imports and then as an engine for growth for economy. Once an industry becomes successful, this creates spin-offs or other sort of successful industries emerge from those successful industries. So examples of that would be the Canadian dairy industry, Brazilian aerospace industry, where we put established barriers, established sort of barriers for other blocking off other competitors, and in return sort of establishing, some protective industry, which then becomes competitive in the global market. And then those industries and their side industries sort of allow for the development of other industries in the country. Another model is the export-led growth, and this is mostly used in the so-called Asian tigers, where they use the foreign demand as an engine to fuel economy. So countries like China, Taiwan, Japan have used this as a model. They lure advanced production from multinational corporations to take advantage of low labor costs, and then use a spillover of human capital that is developed in those industries to climb down the product chain and climb down the economic chain. As part of this climate, as part of this landscape, there are organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which are so-called Bretton Woods institutions. These institutions have a particular sense of the world and what the global market, global capitalism should look like. And this is built around understanding called the Washington Consensus, where a group of international organizations led by US government and multinational corporations and think tanks and pundits and experts come to a consensus on what free market and sound money should look like in relation to economic growth, arguing that both free market, and sound monetary policies are key to economic growth. So they keep pushing for low or non-tariff barriers and balanced budgets and austerity measures at the same time. And in their sort of practices, they use a thing called conditionality, which is a forceful condition that turn each loan into a policy tool. So what that means is that when the IMF or the World Bank gives money to developing countries, they attach conditions in relation to inflation, growth, unemployment rates, social welfare, etc., so that the governments have to change their own policies and make themselves more fit the sort of the mandate of the Washington Consensus to get the loans that they are seeking. So one may argue that this system has created contemporary globalization, where trade barriers were lowered, the global norms have become built around Washington Consensus. But in a way, to use an analogy, at the end of, let's say around 2008, an argument could be made that effects of globalization have really sort of turned on its own creators, in that the Washington Consensus perhaps came to undermine the ability of the United States to have jobs and well-paying jobs in the United States, because all the countries that were poorer have gained production capabilities due to their relative poverty. So that led us to what's called perhaps the Trump's trade wars, when Donald Trump was talking about how the United States was losing billions on trade with virtually every country it does business with, and that to him trade wars are good and easy to win. Example, when we're down 100 billion with a certain country, they get cute. Don't trade anymore, we win big. It's easy, he said. He was referring to China. And you might argue that, of course, that there's a one-sided deal here, that China does sell more goods to the United States because American companies tend to sort of build their things in China. That's because of the reason of what we talked about how profits are made in capitalism. that profit is the cost between the cost of something and the cost of labor, and the difference, the cheaper that your labor is, the more profit that you can make, because that's just how it is. So then you move your jobs, you move your production to places where you're going to pay the least amount of possible money to the laborers. So that creates a trade deficit. And look at the trade imbalance. Look at China joining the World Trade Organization, China joining the Washington Consensus, and how it diverges, how sort of the trade imbalance grows and the imports increase. Well, how does then a tariff work? Well, tariff works in not in the way that Donald Trump understood it to work. It is the consumer that pays the tariff, not the producer. So after a while, the consumer might then sort of turn and start try to buy American-made goods. But the assumption then is that the jobs that are going to come back to the United States are probably not going to be as well paying, because the cost of making something in the United States should still be less than the tariffed good. So the high-paying car-making jobs, etc., are not coming back to the United States from China or from anywhere for that matter, due to like things like automation and industries becoming much more machine-oriented. Historically, as part of globalization, we made the case that trade is good. But trade goes in different ways. Trade is not just the trading of skills or trading of services or trading of goods. It's also trading of undesirable things. And let's meet a guy named Larry Summers. Well, Larry Summers is a pretty famous, influential man. His nickname is Dirty Larry. Larry Summers used to be the chief economist at the World Bank. He then was the U.S. Secretary of Treasury under Clinton administration. He became the United States national head of the director of the U.S. National Economic Council, or Obama's economic czar. And then he was also the president of Harvard University from 2001 to 2006. It would be interesting to see what kind of post, if any post, Larry Summers will get under a Biden administration. It's not unimaginable that he will get a job. But what made him called, or what gave him the nickname Dirty Larry, is this memo when he was the chief economist of the World Bank. The memo was sent to every World Bank employee, and the memo was called the Dirty Industries Memo. And he starts, perhaps miscalculatingly, that between you and me, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of dirty industries to the least developed countries? He says, I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. The costs of pollution are likely to be nonlinear, as the initial increments of pollution probably have very low cost. And I've always thought the underpopulated countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted. Their air quality is probably vastly inefficiently low compared to places like Los Angeles or Mexico City. The problem with arguments against all of these proposals for more pollution in least developed countries, intrinsic rights to certain goods, moral reasons, social concerns, lack of adequate markets, could be turned around and used more or less effectively against every bank proposal for liberalization, which is true, but at the same time, there's a reason why it's true, right? Like, in many ways, if you are to leave with one thing about Marxism or Marxist theories of international politics, it is that they're not particularly good at predicting or understanding what comes after capitalism. They're very good at breaking capitalism apart into its pieces and showing its inner sort of conflicts and inner inconsistencies and inner tensions. Let's take a moment to understand some of those tensions by looking at global economy and how global economy works. I don't know if you've heard of the term Fordism, but Fordism was an economies of scale where things were built as part of a manufacturing belt, as a sort of an assembly line, where from the one end of the factory, raw materials entered, and the other end of the factory, workers build the car, and that was it. That was sort of, Ford was able to make everything in the same factory because they were able to make thousands and thousands of the same kind of car, with the same kind of prescription, like same kind of qualifications and same kind of sort of standards. There was no personalization. There was no deviance from the norm. Everything was made to be the same. But the workers were paid a fair wage, and then they were also able to buy the cars that they were making because they made enough money. But in the last century, things like transportation costs and communications costs have declined so much that the global growth over the course of that same period was 3.5%. And trade works, but the question becomes at what price? And we have entered into a period of what's called post-Fordism, where it's an economy of flexibility, where it chases consumption. There is no real inventory, like what there is a just-in-time inventory, and it's a system that is based on filling a demand. And the example when I talk about this, I give is the Home Depot, where Home Depot is not necessarily a place where you can find thousands of hammers, but what you can find are 10 hammers, and once you buy one, Home Depot store orders another one. So then there's always 10 hammers at the Home Depot store, if the supply chain works. And this is done through what's called a global commodity chain, where things are made in different places, and different parts of the world have different purposes. So cotton may grow in Egypt, t-shirts are made in China, and the sale of that t-shirt happens at a Gap store in downtown Ottawa. So that this demonstrates that production processes are connected, and that the material sourcing, design, distribution, marketing, and consumption happen in different places as part of the same commodity chain. That is also seen as a production chain, where we look at things like design, where it's a high value added job, versus raw materials manufacturing are low value jobs, and marketing sales, again, are high value jobs. High value jobs like design and sales happen in the core parts of the world or core economies, whereas raw materials and manufacturing happens in peripheral parts of the world. So to take back to sort of the original point that we made in this class, where the world is significantly more connected in more ways than one that you may think, let's take the example of Nike as a brand. Well, is Nike an American company, or is Nike just a company? What does it mean to be a company? Well, Nike is designed in Oregon, but maybe made in Cambodia, maybe made in Philippines, maybe made in China. Surplus is always extracted from peripheral, low-skill countries to the core. So the core of Nike's business model looks like this. It's a beautiful campus with high-tech facilities, with training centers and sort of different measurement techniques, and it's a campus. Versus the periphery is a sweatshop or sort of a low-paying factory, where these peripheral countries are replaceable. So whereas the core is the high-profit section of the business, and it's a sort of a service-oriented nodes of production, periphery is where the greatest poverty is, where the easiest environmental standards are, where the lowest labor organization, if at all, is, and it has the lowest tax rates for the companies. So in the case of Nike, design, marketing, and advertising happens in Oregon, in Portland. And places like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan becomes complex industrial production partners, where they're the developed partners. And places like Vietnam, China, Mexico are labor-intensive, low-tech production, where they're just making the shoes. Whereas, Japan, South Korea makes parts of the important parts of the shoe, versus like Portland is where the core is. This understanding of the world, this sort of division of the world into sort of a core and periphery, comes from a Marxist theorist called Immanuel Wallerstein, where he argues that the world is not divided among states, but rather the world is a system where there's a single division of labor, despite different political and cultural systems. So various sectors or areas are dependent on economic exchange with others for the smooth and continuous provisioning of the needs of the area. So the world is not divided, for Wallerstein or for the Marxist, among nations, but among class. So states compete in this system because, well, there are no other jobs available. That they sort of this competition of more and more poverty is in a way kind of a ladder out of the poverty. So this brings foreign investment, and in that attempt to bring foreign investment, poverty becomes a comparative advantage, hoping that creating jobs will create a trickle-down effect on wages. It also has an impact on the environment, that this creates what's called a race to the bottom. In these jurisdictions with no natural advantage, they compete with each other to provide the best investment environment. They provide low environmental standards, tax holidays, free infrastructure. They prevent and quash any kind of unions or labor organization. Sometimes states even pay subsidies to the corporations. And the things are produced in these places called export processing zones, where there are no trade barriers and no trade tariffs. And then furthermore, subcontractors, even in those places, compete among themselves to provide even lower wages. So even though this sort of capitalism provides a veil of accountability and responsibility, reality is that there are no labor laws, there are low health standards, there's no safety standards, no regulations. These are hazardous working conditions. And at the same time, people who work in these places can basically barely afford a living, because what they make versus what things cost, it's not like the Fordist economy where the workers can actually make a living. In these places like export processing zones, women get quite are primarily employed, and there is a lot of harassment and sexual abuse, etc., that happens in these places. So they're terrible places to work. So one might argue that capital mobility is a democratic process. It diversifies assets. It allows for the mitigation of risk and acceptance of risk, and that it is just the way things are. But if we look at the model versus reality, what we see is free trade and lower investment barriers do not affect the labor market. They don't make the market better. Capital-rich countries tend to invest in other capital-rich countries, which offer high return. And wages over time do not equalize among services, and that workers in rich countries tend to earn more. So, one might argue again that restricting trade worsens poverty. Trade does lead to growth, and domestic inequality is not correlated to globalization. And places like China and India have the 40% of the world's total population. So it just that they are important actors. So that there's a reason why jobs tend to sort of gravitate towards those countries. So in a way, underdevelopment then is not a problem that emerges from capitalism, but rather it's the condition of capitalism, because capitalism requires new markets, new commodities, and cheap labors. So these expansion into colonies or post-colonies allows for super profits or the super exploitation of labor. So then profits then get repatriated to the core, which then is a net drain from the periphery. So things don't change from the Marxists. So semi-periphery in this case sometimes lends stability to the system. These countries that are making a bit better, but not super better, so they're not living in abject poverty, but they're sort of like living a little bit better, become sort of like, in a way, stabilizing force into the system. But this is not all doom and gloom, right? Like, on the other hand, if we look at the averages, trade is improving the world. The world is growing as a result of trade. But what kind of trade? Perhaps a different ethical question, again, for sort of like a 2020 Marxist or 2020 sort of social-minded individual is, what kind of trade is better? Whereas free trade is unrestricted trade driven by supply and demand, fair trade is a certification that ensures fair prices are paid in places like farm gates and oversees certain kinds of social and environmental standards. So, in conclusion, capitalism is about exploitation of labor and lower wages, because lower wages mean higher profits. And if free market, if it keeps being unregulated, causes sociopolitical problems in things like Occupy movement, Arab Spring, etc. But ideology and the hope for the future and our sort of shared investment into the understanding of capitalism keeps the system intact. It distracts our attention from the real perpetrators, that we all believe that we can be rich, so we don't want to dismantle the system. And in many ways, that is the way in which the international system works too. Every country does feel that they can be developed, so they don't want to change the system because they all feel that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And that is in many ways, I think, where Marx gets the things wrong about why the revolution will happen. And I think capitalism keeps getting things right because I think there is very little theorization of what hope is. All right, I'll leave it at that. So take care.